The third panel will start soon, so please be seated. I will start, okay? Yeah, welcome. Welcome to the Korea Foundation Global Seminar's third panel session, Actions for a Multicultural World. And it is my honor to introduce to you the panel moderator, Dr. Howard Duncan, the executive head of the Metropolis. As an expert both in the theory and practice of immigration integration, multiculturalism, and globalization and the migration, Dr. Duncan joined Metropolis project in 1997 and became its executive head in 2002, where he has concentrated on the increasing the demographic reach of Metropolis, enlarging the range of issues it confronts, and increasing its benefits to the international migration policy community by creating opportunities for direct and frank exchanges between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. So from now on, Dr. Duncan will moderate the panel. Dr. Duncan, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Moderating this panel that will complete the cycle for this conference. We're going to be looking at actions for a multicultural world. And because we are running so very late, I think I will keep my opening remarks extremely brief. We'll open with Kukyom Han, who is the representative of the Women Migrants Human Rights Center of Korea and is also a minister of the Presbyterian Church here in Korea. Our second presenter will be Irena Omelaniuk, who, as you all know from the lunchtime presentation, is a senior advisor with the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Now, I will go third, and because we are running against a very tight schedule, we are going to continue to close this session at 3. Well, in fact, I have been asked to close it at 3:20. We may slip it to 3:30, but we are not going to be slipping beyond the originally scheduled time. So, in the interest of expediency, could you please welcome Kukyom Han?
Nice to meet you. Today's the presenters comes from the researchers and the scholars. This is a special time from the perspective of activists of NGO in Korea. And exactly I cannot speak English well, so after my presentation, I'll show how we can overcome to the language barrier in discussion time. So. Now I'll begin my presentation, and then the English speak. Then just to follow watch the monitor, because I prepare the PowerPoint. So don't my pronunciation just. And particularly, my presentation is based on experience of Women Migrant Human Rights Center of Korea. Let me briefly describe the situation of a multicultural Korean society. The population of migrant workers, marriage immigrants, and foreign nationals in the country is constantly increased due to various social developments such as the avoidance of labor incentive, the job colloquially called 3D jobs, the influx of marriage immigrants, mostly from Asian countries, and the easing of immigration policy for overseas Koreans, that of opening up doors for ethnic Koreans to regain the Korean citizenship. The government established the 2007 to 2008 basic plan of foreign policy and defined Korean society as becoming a multicultural society in earnest. In short, the Korean government examines the appearance of permanent immigrant like marriage migration immigrants as a proof that Korean society is becoming a multicultural society, and established several policies pertaining to this. In fact, the appearance of multicultural in Korea is related to the increasing number of international marriages. As the government started marriage women migrant support project and research on their actual conditions, the issue on support for social adaptation emerged. As a result, social integration support policy for marriage immigrants and their children was announced as a potential task on 26 April 2006. Its present vision that is a realization of open multicultural society with the term multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural coexisting society. From the point, the other government agencies have used the term multicultural society. Government coined the international marriage family as a multicultural family in 2008, which emphasized the Korean society as becoming a multicultural society, thus enacting of the Support Multicultural Family Act. After that, the term multicultural itself has been used to designate the international marriage family. Marriage migrant women glamorized with the name of a multicultural family are guaranteed the status of mother of Korean children to as one of the solution of a low birth rate problem and caregiver of an aging society. The term multicultural family implies the risk which treats women with the term multicultural family as instruments of childbirth and caregiving. Although Korean government and the society talks about open multicultural society, it is more likely to be closed multicultural society. This is because government carries on assimilating migrants with the name of social integration, but explicitly do not recognize undocumented migrants as a member of Korean society based on basic law concerning foreigners in Korea, which defines foreigners as a member of a multicultural society and as a legal resident. The fundamental problem of a government basis plan of foreign policies is that it claims to create a multicultural society, but the policy is of discriminative nature and relegate migrant human security for national security. As the number of migrants increases, the Korean government carries out varying policies and systems which are oftentimes contradictory and inconsistent with other laws and policies affecting the community of migrants and immigrants. Conflict between nation security and migrant security in foreign policy is one of the most serious issues. It's emphasized that it is important to prevent unreasonable discrimination against foreigners and to establish social norm and citizens' ethical code for coexistence of various ethnic groups and culture. However, the problem is that the government established the open door policy focusing on order and safety because it believes a multicultural society will face social conflict due to immigrants' laws, social and economic status. The emphasis on order and safety is always accompanied by crackdown on undocumented migrant workers. It proceeds with related policies such as abolishment of limitation on investigation authority of immigration office personnel, establishment of immigration investigation squad, improvement of crackdown infrastructure including personnel, vehicles, and equipment. In the context of a globalized world, the nation guarantees its citizen security. However, the security of undocumented migrant workers is never protected by the nation. Hence, the security of migrants moving across the border should be reviewed in terms of individual security, not as in the national security. In this discussion, the concept of security has been adopted from the definition of security by UNDP. UNDP insists that the individual security has a priority over the national security. It regards every factor possible threatening human peace as a threat to the security. Its concept of the individual security contains freedom from economic difficulty, quality of life, freedom, and human rights. Why should we discuss the security of migrants from the above perspective? It is because migrant existence, life, and dignity are threatened under national security. Most of migrants in South Korea live under dangerous threat. In particular, undocumented migrant workers suffer from the threat to existence, unstable life, and infringement of human rights. A practical engagement is necessary to promote their human security. Generally, infringement of life workers' human rights can be classified into various categories, including infringement of labor rights and basic rights. Especially undocumented migrant workers suffer from more severe infringement of human rights. Especially undocumented migrant workers suffer from more severe infringement of rights. Crackdown on undocumented migrant workers is very similar to human hunting, even ignoring the Miranda principle. Pregnant women were deported, and some undocumented workers fell from the building while avoiding crackdown. They also target the workers who served at the Migrant Workers Union and deported him. The above-mentioned cases provide the momentum to request the government to take more fundamental measures in improve migrant workers' human rights. Human rights issues of women migrants have a different aspect from the general migrant human rights issues. Migrant workers attempted to commit suicide in fear of expulsion after sexual assault by employer. It showed the current situation on women migrant workers' human rights. When it comes to marriage migrant women, their number increased more than 10% each year. Exactly 70% of international migrant marriages, mostly connected by international marriage brokers. Many government ministries have established various policies because they regard marriage migrant women as potential Korean nationals or candidates for Korean citizenship. However, most of government policies are intended for social integration of marriage migration into Korean patriarchal family culture. This endangers marriage migrants' human rights. Even this experience, the homicide of some marriage migration women unveiled the miserable situation regarding human rights of marriage migration in South Korea. Most of marriage migration suffer from diverse types of violence, such as verbal abuse, cultural violence, and sexual abuse. According to investigation in 2010 by Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, 47% of marriage migrants women had experience of domestic violence. Migrant organizations and civil society organizations endeavor to improve the rights of and the interest of migrants. Their advocacy advocacy include the following activities: providing Korean language and Korean culture classes to protect their human rights at risk, and shelter home migration, advocating changing the cost in its restrict workers to change their workplace, and the employer-centered policies, ensuring the right to health care, urging to legalize undocumented migrant workers, stop crackdown on undocumented migrant workers, and to ensure the right to education and the right to live of children of undocumented migrant workers, and supporting to protect the human rights of migrant women, and campaigning to establish social security net. We have struggled with two tasks to eliminate discrimination and share life, peace, and equalities of migrant women. One is protecting human rights of migrant women. The other is empowering activities for migrant women to have power. In doing their activities, the importance of solidarity activities is raised, which are national and international solidarity. There are successful examples to make government introduce or change its policies through the solidarity with migrant women organizations, campaign and promotion against the sex and racial discrimination for international marriage, a campaign to save migrant women who murdered their husband due to domestic violence, campaign against violence on migrant women. Recently, a campaign has been launched to ensure the right of married migrants to settle in the country. In order to humanize the plight of married women, it is important to expand the sisterhood and networking to women's organization and the international organization in Asia, besides domestic NGOs, because the effort of individual or NGOs in receiving countries are insufficient. It is necessary to work with individual or NGOs, women, married migrants, sending countries together. A good example is the campaign against human trafficking in marriage migration by Women's Organization of Vietnam and South Korea in the summer of 2006. One daily newspaper carried out the article which seemed to promote human trafficking in marriage migration. The Association of Vietnamese Students in Korea, named INV, started a mass protest, and Korean women's organizations joined in and launched a national campaign against the advertisement of sexual, racial, discriminative international marriage brokers business. The close cooperation and solidarity of civil society in both countries brought these issues to public attention in Korea and Vietnam. As a result, Korean people became alert on human trafficking in marriage migration, and it eventually provoked the policy shift. Our center organized several Forum Asian Women Migrant Strategy discussion for protection and prevention of human trafficking in international marriage, and invited some organizations and social activists from 6 major migrant labor and marriage migrant sending countries. Also, we visited some international organizations and shared the serious of human trafficking originated in international marriage. In fact, the phenomenon of international marriage is categorized neither as a migration nor human trafficking issues in Asia, because prostitution of women and children are too serious in region. While visiting those countries, we promised to collaborate to prevent human trafficking in international marriage. Meanwhile, our solidarity work has developed to build a solidarity platform with other organizations. Another challenge is the civil society organizations' stance that appeal to nowadays. We have this one crisis. The one challenge is the civil society organization stance that appeal to government-friendly civil. Yeah. Oh. Anyway, it's different. Yeah. So another challenge is the civil society organizations' stance that appear to be government-friendly civil society organizations and are not exempt from xenophobic orientation, which mirrors of conservative society. One of social ills has been the government adoption program on multicultural society and provide multicultural project with which some CSOs have participated in, helped in spreading government-driven multicultural discourses. These organizations were not generally interested in making of a multicultural society, but performed multicultural-related projects supported by government and jumped in the bandwagon. As society gets conservative xenophobic CSOs raise their voices loudly moment. There are broad extreme right-wing organizations that have built a solidarity platform and set out logic, patriotism, and national interest. Also, their growing influence and government-friendly multicultural discourse threaten human rights and the security of migrants. Therefore, civil organizations of researchers who advocated for migrant human rights and human security should endeavor to express pressure to its own government to ensure human rights and the security of migrants. If these efforts to ensure the right of the descendant livelihood of migrants, ease their discomfort and recover their dignity, these will ensure human security and further contribute to world peace. Human security is linked to promoting peace because human security defines all factors of harming peace as a security threat. One side and the single-handed effort is of either migrant destination of country of origin country cannot comprehensively deal with the issues of feminization of migration. In recognizing the necessity of close cooperation between migrant countries of origin and destination, the solidarity platform can be having meaning and power. I have a dream, no discrimination against the migrant workers. I invite you all for this work. I like the one connotation, some articles. If you dream alone, it's just a dream. If you dream together, it became a reality. One voice is not enough. Two voices are not enough either. When we get together and raise our voices, it will set the press free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Han. I can guarantee that you would get a lot of interest in your presentation and the work of your organization, not only from this part of the world, but in Canada and I dare say in most of the OECD countries who are struggling with some of these same issues. So thank you very much for a very revealing presentation. Irena, can I call on you now?
Hello, everybody, again. I'm going to follow on where I left off at lunchtime, and I'm going to make it quick. It's completely different from what Reverend Hanne has just presented to us, and I'm wondering sometimes where I actually fit into this, but I will refer back to what I mentioned over lunch, namely the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and my purpose for being at this meeting, I think, is more to look at the structures and the processes behind the actions. How can you move forward policies? How can you actually make choices, the right choices about policies? How do you know what options exist if you don't have the appropriate consultation processes in place, if you don't have the appropriate budgets to pay for such processes? Who pays for it? Who benefits? How do countries of origin and destination get together to discuss exactly the kinds of issues that Reverend Hanneke has just raised with us? And so I'm going to run very quickly through this and hope that you'll ask me questions that may enlighten us all a little more. I had 2 points to make in the interests of advancing the debate on global approaches to coexistence. One is that international migration diplomacy, let me go back to the first slide, international migration diplomacy is a critical challenge for policymakers in the 21st century. In an age where all kinds of new forms of cooperation are required to deal with global issues at the local level and local challenges at the global level, we are in serious need of an ability to be able to talk to each other about these issues. The way we've been talking the last couple of days, but probably at a more practical level so that you can translate some of the ideas you've heard into viable policies and actions. My second point is that the Global Forum on Migration Development is one of the new models for global cooperation on migration in the context of development. It supports networking. It supports networking and offers a platform for governments and their non-state partners to hone the international migration diplomacy skills through conflict-free and non-binding dialogue. There are already some fairly new or recent models of global cooperation towards managing diversity, and they include bilateral agreements, regional consultation processes, and of course, coming back to my focus, namely the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Starting with bilateral labor models, possibly the most expedient form of cooperation between migrant sending and receiving countries. These have evolved from large-scale labor imports from lower-income countries by Europe and the US some 40 to 50 years ago, which left long and complicated legacies of unplanned secondary migration, to a smaller, smarter, more sector-specific set of programs that we see today between countries like Mexico, Guatemala, or the Caribbean, and Canada, or between Mauritius and France, or between Pacific Islands and New Zealand and Australia. These kinds of bilateral agreements have increasingly become a means for lower-income countries with a labor surplus to negotiate business deals with labor-needy countries for labor exchange on mutually satisfactory terms. In a new approach, a handful of labor migration agreements specifically aim at development outcomes, targeting low-skilled workers in depressed regions and sectors. I'm thinking here specifically of the South Pacific program with Australia. I'm thinking also of the Guatemala program with Canada. Over time, countries of origin like the Philippines have been able to set their own terms within the context of these bilateral agreements. Minimum contract, standard contracts, minimum wage levels, and so on. Other countries of origin like Mauritius have negotiated labor mobility agreements with receiving countries like France based on shared responsibility for example, skills training and matching the skills with the jobs for optimal outcomes. And in the context of discussing these kinds of models, other countries could benefit from more efficient and cost-shared and empowering labor exchange arrangements like these. Regional and interregional consultation processes on migration have also emerged in recent years since the 1990s and give states an opportunity to join forces with their neighbors and other like-minded countries to find joint solutions across borders. The regional consultation processes are voluntary, informal, non-binding structures for dialogue that have proliferated in most regions. In Asia, for example, many of you will be familiar with the Colombo process that originated among migrant sending countries seeking to strengthen their advocacy amongst themselves with receiving countries through solidarity on better protection and support of their workers by host countries and host regions like the Gulf countries. Today, members of the Colombo process also form part of an expanded intra-regional Abu Dhabi dialogue, which includes the Gulf Cooperation country member states as major recipients and employers of foreign labor from the Colombo process countries. A loose framework agreement on regional cooperation has resulted from the Abu Dhabi dialogue meetings of late and is seen as a big step towards optimizing the benefits of migration for all involved: the migrants, their families, the communities that they come from, and the host communities. Other regional consultation processes in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa have set in place the frameworks for more freedom of movement across borders, including visa-free arrangements and common passports. These are, of course, enjoying varying degrees of success, sometimes not even working at all properly, and simply not operational on the ground, since the best intentioned policies often fail in the implementation. The Global Forum on Migration and Development, a global dialogue and consultation process created by the states for the states, has modelled itself on the regional processes. It brings together policymakers to network and share practical examples and models, a little like the ones that I mentioned over lunch. It has emerged as the largest, most inclusive global forum of its kind. It's voluntary, it's outside the UN system. It engages governments and their non-state partners in multilateral debate on migration in a non-combative way. So I can go into the history of it, but it's pretty boring. I mean, it was established in 2006 at a high-level dialogue by a majority of agreement by the UN member states, and there's a second high-level dialogue coming up next year in New York, where we will take stock, among others, of how the Global Forum has fared. But the point about the Global Forum is that it makes connections between migration and development and builds networks between countries, regions, public and private sector, etc. The development factor in this has provided useful context and a measure of the effectiveness of migration policies and programs. It's helped the debate to remain conflict-free. It also is a legitimate rationale for migration policymakers seeking government and other support for any of their new integration approaches, for example, at home, and a context in which to discuss these with other governments and to take some new ideas back to their constituencies. While multiculturalism has only been included or incidental, in an incidental way in the migration and development discussion, it was a key theme in Athens in 2009 and has permeated the discussions throughout the 6 years of the Global Forum's existence. Increasingly, the Global Forum has made the same discovery as Christian gave us yesterday about the limitations, indeed the possible redundancy of policies, especially aimed at migrants or integration, and I think Warren and others have made the same point. Migrant integration has been discussed from various practical angles without becoming entangled in policy dogma and categorization such as civic integration versus multiculturalism. A favorable policy environment for all which observes international principles of protection of rights, non-discrimination, access to basic health and education can enable migrants to be equal members of society. But it also empowers them as diaspora or migrants, people working abroad, willing to reinvest in their lower income countries of origin. And that's where the axis is between migration and development, or one of them, on this issue of integration or multiculturalism. In Belgium, for example, the portability of healthcare under the Mutuel healthcare system has encouraged Moroccan doctors to build a hospital in Morocco, certified by the Belgian healthcare system and offering low-cost treatment. The benefits accrue to the migrants in Belgium, the Belgian healthcare system, and the country of origin health infrastructure. In other destination countries like Australia, Canada, or the US, permanent residency or citizenship. I'm the worst offender at this. In other countries like Australia and Canada, permanent residency or citizenship with their attendant entitlements encourage migrants to return to their countries of origin, as I mentioned today with the Chinese example, and conduct trade and business between the two countries without fear of losing their status through prolonged absence. In France, as I also said earlier, the education system uses teachers from the countries of origin in the Maghreb to help ease migrant children into the schools in the host society. What has the GFMD achieved? Probably the greatest value of the forum may well lie in the process itself. It is one of the best examples, I guess, or perhaps one of the worst examples, but it's one of the most visible examples of new forms of cooperation. Governments, as I say, get together with private sector, civil society, diaspora, and anybody who's involved in the entire migration enterprise to discuss possible policy approaches to all kinds of situations, including trafficking. But as long as it has some relevance for development, and of course underlying all of this is the assumption that certain policies along the migration route can have an impact on the way that migrants can develop themselves, develop their families, and contribute to development back home. Whatever the outcomes in terms of concrete policy changes from this kind of a consultation process at the multilateral level, or impacts on the migrants and their families, the forum has helped to change how governments and their non-state partners think about migration and development, how they deal with each other on these issues. The greatest value of the forum, therefore, may well lie in the process itself, which is informal, in other words, non-binding, so there are no negotiated outcomes, and it's inclusive. 140, 50 plus governments are engaged in the Global Forum, and they bring to the table extraordinary issues. This year, for example, we focused the whole labour mobility debate on skills. Skills as a driver for development, skills as something that can be a major obstacle for mobility between countries. It can be an obstacle for proper matching of jobs and skills abroad. And all of the flow-on effects, if your skills are not recognized and you're not matched to the job properly, you will not be entitled to the same remuneration, to the minimum wage. Hence, it reduces your capacity to, for example, care for your family, send remittances home, in your home country, or even save in the destination country. If that's one of the foci that we had this year in the Global Forum debate, where skills were seen as a critical issue at the interface between migration and development. Also because even developed countries have very poorly constructed and very poorly developed facilities and mechanisms to recognize, accredit, certify people for skills. And in developing countries, it's even worse. So many people who have gone abroad and either enhanced their skills or picked up new skills, when they come home are unable to use those. So the skills recognition and certification issue was relevant not just to people going abroad, but to those people coming back home to complete the circularity. And when people are not able to use their skills when they come home, they're likely to go back abroad again, which is not a bad thing, but many of the developing countries, in particular countries like Mauritius, who chaired and hosted the Global Forum this year, this is a big issue. So how does Mauritius, for example, solve that issue? They negotiate agreements, bilateral labour agreements, with countries like France or Canada, where they build into the agreement a cost-sharing arrangement on skills development. And for the Mauritians, the skills that their people pick up, or the skills that they develop before they go and they pick up overseas, are supposed to be helpful as part of the sectoral development initiatives back home in Mauritius. So the whole temporary labour migration contract that Mauritius has with France, for example, is embedded in Mauritius's national development strategy. And it's something that I've also discussed with the Trinidad and Tobago colleagues here, who also have a national development strategy into which they embed their national diversity and integration policies. And there are a number of governments that have started to do that over recent years. Some of them actually directly ascribe this new development in their own governance of migration in the context of its development outcomes to the Global Forum and to the debates in the Global Forum, which have brought to light some of these possible ways of doing things and possible policy options. So, in itself, the Global Forum is a new model for global cooperation. It facilitates policy networking. It's created a new culture of cooperation, a new habit of cooperation. And I'm very happy to discuss anything further that you may wish to know about it. You should all be at that kind of a forum because you all have a tale to tell. And the forum is in the process, I think, of institutionalizing a toolkit, a policy toolkit, so that governments can, again, by choice and voluntarily, sift through the toolkit of possible policy options for any one of these migration issues, like integration, and select the one that they think fits their circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irena. The Global Forum is certainly capturing the world's attention these days, and we all want to wish it well, and as it heads to Sweden in a couple of years' time with the break for the high-level dialogue next year. What I would like to do is take advice from Dimitri Papadimitriou, who suggested that we pay attention to context. And this is what I'll do for the first part of my presentation. And that context is one that has been, for me at least, surprisingly absent in the discussions over the last day and a half. And that context is the demographic context. We've had allusions to it from a couple of people this morning, but I had somehow expected it would dominate the conversation. Now, I think it's pretty well known to most of us here that Korea is considered to be the most rapidly aging society in the world right now. It is not the oldest yet, but it is headed in that direction. But this issue is much broader than Korea, and although, to use a North American expression, this may not be the elephant in the room, but I think it's at least a medium-sized dog, or maybe an elk. But it is something that we need, I think, to consider when we talk, indeed, about multiculturalism, and I'll try to explain why. Now, Some of you will recall that about a year ago, the world reached a population of 7 billion people. And this was, by most people, at least in writing in the Western media, considered to be a cause for dismay. We have done a terrible job, people were saying, with reproductive rights, a terrible job with the rights of women, and as a result, look where we're at, 7 billion people. We've got climate change, we've got all kinds of challenges, and this is only going to exacerbate them. And it reminded me of the debate back in the late 1960s when an American, Paul Ehrlich, wrote a book called The Population Bomb, in which he tried to terrify us all and predicted, in fact, that we were going to experience mass famine, war, violence in the 1970s. Well, of course, this didn't happen because the Green Revolution in agriculture took place, and in fact, none of Ehrlich's predictions came true. But interestingly enough, the media called him up again a year ago to ask him, what does he think? Okay, you may have gotten it wrong back in the 1960s, but what do you think now? And he of course, was sticking to his guns. He just said, I got the date wrong. But remember, the Green Revolution depended on petroleum-based fertilizers, and of course, now we're running out of oil. Except he got that one wrong too. But where I think the entire debate went wrong was in noticing something much more interesting than just population size for the globe, and that is the distribution of the population around the world and trends in that regard. Now, there's some extraordinary things taking place that are going to have ramifications for immigration and all of the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. Now, I don't have time to go into any kind of detail, but just think of this. The population of the globe is shifting quite dramatically from the developed world to the developing world. And if you go back, I'll just give you a couple numbers, just to maybe just spice it up a little bit. Back in 1700, 20% of the world lived in Europe. 20% of the population of the globe lived in Europe. By 1913, 33% of the world's population lived in the developed countries. That is to say, Europe, North America, Australia. By 2003, that number had gone down to 17%. And if we look at the UN's population projections, by 2050, 12% of the world's population will live in the developed countries. And if you consider some of the implications of this, I think it's going to be a wake-up call for all of us. Here's one more number, and I'm not going to give you many numbers today, there's just no time, but one more number. If you take the current population of the world, age 15 and under, that's 1-5. And this, of course, is soon to be much of the world's labor force. 90% of the world's population under the age 15 lives in the developing world. 90%. So when we in the West, and I'm including Korea here because you're a developed country, when we in the West talk about our future labor forces, we're talking about either seeing them shrink, and by the way, Korea's labor force is expected to peak in 2018. That's not very far off. And Korea's population is expected to peak in 2020 and then decline. So where are we in the West going to get our workers from? It gets tighter than this because we in the West are, and some of us are already there, in a post-manufacturing economy. Our middle classes in North America were built out of a manufacturing economy, which is rapidly moving through this race to the bottom. with respect to wages. And so we're outsourcing an awful lot of our manufacturing, and that trend is likely to continue. So countries like Canada, countries like the United States, countries like Korea are going to be increasingly relying upon innovation to alter their economies in ways that are going to be able to maintain our quality of life. Where is the innovation going to come from? Where is the willingness to invest going to come from? Where is entrepreneurship going to come from in societies that are aging? I tend not to associate innovation with old age. And I'll count myself among this phenomenon. I mean, if you think about the need for innovation, if you think about the need for investment, and you think about what I said before, that 90% of the world's under age 15 population is in the developing world, this is going to put an even tighter frame on the availability of talent, the sort of talent that's going to power modern economies, because a lot of these developing countries do not have the education systems to support that talent base that countries are increasingly looking for. And we often talk about the global competition for talent, but in my country we tend to think of the competitors as the Americans, as the Europeans, and of course the Australians. But increasingly the competition is going to be from China, it's going to be from India, it's going to be from other countries that we now consider to be developing. So what we're going to be finding is an accelerating and intensifying global competition for talent. So we can't just look at the situation here in Korea or in Canada. We can't just look at the situation in Canada. This is a global phenomenon, and the question immediately presents itself: which societies are going to do well in this competition? Now, of course, there are a myriad of factors that are going to determine success. But something that we're rapidly entering, in fact, in my view, we're already there, is a seller's market for high-skilled labor, a seller's market for talent. It's not going to be enough for countries simply to open their doors and say, we're willing to receive your application to come to our country, because there aren't going to be enough people with those kinds of skills to meet the needs. And you're seeing countries like China being very, very aggressive in their recruitment of what they simply call talent. So one thing that in a seller's market you have is a very high level of mobility, and what some people refer to as the new mobility is a strong factor in this situation. And so countries that attune their immigration policies to the new mobility, to understand that migrants have choices, especially those at the high skill end have choices, and as we heard before, are willing to move and move again and move again. The idea of migration being a one-way permanent flow at the high skill end is long gone. So how are countries that face a talent shortage going to compete? Well, one element that I think stands a country like my own is the liberal integration policy and set of programming that it has. And because I was asked to speak about Canadian multiculturalism policy and the Multiculturalism Act, I'll restrict myself to that. I would like to suggest that in Canada's case, one thing on its side in this international competition for talent is in fact going to be its multiculturalism policy. Why? Because it allows for the new mobility to find expression, because it allows immigrants to come to the country without feeling a need to lock themselves in to the new society in ways that Will described eloquently in terms of coercion, in fact. So what I would like to do in the roughly 7 minutes that I've got left is walk you through some parts of the Canadian Multiculturalism Act. Now this isn't something that I hear get done very often, and it seems to me that sometimes people, and I'm not referring to either any of the speakers here, but even in Canada, a lot of people talk about multiculturalism in ways that really bear very little resemblance to what's in the Act. I would encourage any of you who have an interest in multiculturalism to read the Canadian Multiculturalism Act. You can Google it, it's easy to find, and here it is. It will take you 10 minutes to read this act. This, by the way, is in both English and French. There's a bunch of tables of contents and so on. The whole act is roughly 3 pages. So it's very accessible, very easy. But I regard this act, which goes back to in the mid-1980s, the policy goes back to 1970, as actually quite profound. I am startled every time I read this piece of legislation. And for those of you who are thinking about multiculturalism, especially for those of you in Korea who are embarking down this road, I just want to give you a sense of what we in Canada, at least what legislators in Canada 40 years ago were thinking about. And I'll do this fairly systematically. So I'm going to read some of this. The second paragraph tells us that this act means business. It says, and whereas the Constitution of Canada recognizes the importance of preserving and enhancing the multicultural heritage of Canadians. This is fundamental legislation. Multiculturalism, in fact, is part of the Constitution of this country, and that has implications for other legislation. It prevents certain types of legislation from being enacted, and it promotes the enactment of certain types of legislation that is consonant with this particular act. Towards the end of the preamble, it says, and whereas the Government of Canada recognizes the diversity of Canadians as regards race, national or ethnic origin, color, and religion as, here's the point, as a fundamental characteristic of Canadian society, and is committed to, and the government is committed to, a policy of multiculturalism designed to preserve and enhance the multicultural heritage of Canadians, and here's the next important part, while working to achieve the equality of all Canadians in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of Canada. Now, this is all in the preamble. This strikes me as pretty profound stuff for 1970. But as Will described the context, social policy ruled the day in Canada in the late 60s and up to the mid-70s. Economic policy wasn't something that we cared very much about, in which case we ended up with extraordinary deficits to deal with. But there you go. Now, when we get into the actual clauses of the Act, I think things get very interesting. There was a little debate between Christian and Will about the compatibility between multiculturalism and civic integration. We can interpret these documents as we will, but I've got a particular take on this that I'd like to describe. So in the early parts of the section described as the multiculturalism policy of Canada, it says that the Government of Canada will recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism reflects the cultural and racial diversity of Canadian society and acknowledges the freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. You can tell right from the beginning that in Canada, multiculturalism was not designed to separate communities one from another. And there's more on this a little bit later. The next clause says that the Government of Canada will recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism is a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage and identity. Now, when we think about some other countries where identity is considered to be historically determined, or perhaps, as we heard earlier today, defined in terms of bloodlines, in Canada, according to this piece of legislation, according to the Constitution, our national identity is defined in terms of our multicultural heritage. And it gets better. The Government of Canada will promote the full and equitable participation of individuals and communities of all origins in the continuing evolution and shaping of all aspects of Canadian society. There's a couple things here that I want to draw your attention to. Some interpreters would differ with me on this. I don't know how Will or Christian will react to this, but in this it seems to me is an implicit concept of immigrant integration, or the integration of minorities in Canada. It strikes me that in this act, we have the concept of integration as participation in society. Now, what kind of participation? Well, I go back a couple of pages. Participation in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of Canada. In other words, integration has nothing to do with cultural transformation. It's not a matter of arriving in the country, learning about its, not only its language, but its cultural values, its history, and so on, and adopting those as your own and leaving your homeland cultures behind. It has nothing to do with that. Integration is participation, and in participation is contribution. Contribution to the evolving nature of Canadian society. Will referred earlier today to the additive concept of identity, where there was the original sense of identity, and layered upon that over time would be other identities, and that the Canadian identity would be this amalgam of all. I don't know if I've got him exactly right, but a slight nuance on this might be to think in using the concept of evolution. Now, this is something for societies that define their identities in terms of fixed historical contexts. This is something that is perhaps a little bit jarring, because we're talking in Canada about the possibility over time of what might have been considered the original Canadian identity vanishing. But that's what's in this piece of legislation. We have beyond this, and this is something that even in Canada we hear a lot of criticism about, especially in the province of Quebec, where there is in some ways a rejection of multiculturalism in favor of a concept of interculturalism, the assumption here being that multiculturalism divides and interculturalism at least builds bridges, if not unites. A little further down in the Act, however, it says the Government of Canada will promote the understanding and creativity that arise from the interaction between individuals and communities of different origins. The intention behind multiculturalism in Canada, as we have heard earlier today, is to build community, build the Canadian society, and to integrate minorities into this society, to integrate immigrants into this society. Again, nothing whatsoever to do with preserving differences for creating parallel societies, or to put it another way, nothing in here about excluding minorities from the mainstream, which of course you get in some other societies, in fact, by design. So look, I've spent my 20 minutes. The point that I want to make here is simply that when you get into the legislation, you have some pretty fundamental choices that the government of Canada made 42 years ago. Choices that the original English and French cultures were not going to be defining cultures of Canada, were not going to be definitive of the Canadian identity. Rather, the Canadian identity would evolve over time as immigration continued and continues over the years. And it is an open-ended set of ideas in this legislation. This has worked out extremely well in Canada. And I believe it has worked out extremely well in Australia. So for those of you in Korea, and I acknowledge what a number of people have told me over breakfasts, over lunches, over dinners, that public opinion towards immigration and public opinion towards multiculturalism is turning a bit negative here. But I want to suggest that in the Canadian experience and in the Australian experience, there is a great deal of hope to be had. And I can't help but remark on the vision that Korea is now embarking upon to turn itself into a multicultural society. The demographics suggest, however, that the depths of diversity that are in your future, if you do embark upon a robust immigration policy, that the depths of diversity are such that you have never plumbed before. But there are ways to manage this. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Now, we have roughly 40 minutes before I've been asked to close this session down. Normally, we would have a discussion amongst the panelists, followed by a break, followed by questions and answers from the audience, but we simply don't have time for all that. So let's go straight to questions from the audience, and if we're lucky, answers from the panel. Now, we've had 3 very different presentations today, so it would be very useful for you to tell us not only who you are, but tell us to whom you are addressing your question. And we are going to have a bit of translation help for Reverend Han. So if you have a question for Reverend Han, please don't have something very, very long, because the person behind her is going to have to do some interpreting for her. So keep your questions, especially for her, as short as possible. So, do we have any questions to any of us? So let's start here, and here. We'll take 3.
Hello, this is Kato Jotaro from Japan. Actually, I'm an NGO activist in Japan, which supported undocumented workers mainly. And I'd like to have a question to Ms. Han. And I really respect your activities here in Korea, especially I understand you work really hard with migrant ladies. And my question is, beginning of the stage, migrants ladies, maybe they are sexually exploited, they are the victim of the domestic violence, so they must need power first. So I'd like to know the process, how you motivate, your organization motivates these kind of female women then so do the activity like CERT. It's my question to Ms. Han. Thank you.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you. And let's go to the row behind.
Thank you, Howard. My name is Acap Somantri from Indonesia. I have two questions. The first question to Irena. After we heard the presentation during 2 days, we have understanding on the benefit and potential negative impact as well as the challenges of multiculturalism. I think this course on the multiculturalism need to be continued into multi-arena, including the Global Forum on Migration and Development. My question is how to bring the agenda of multiculturalism into agenda of Global Forum on Migration and Development. It is timely to have a broad perspective from sending countries and receiving countries in how the multiculturalism become the future cooperation in terms of migration and development. The second question to you, Howard, from your paper, in the last paper, you mentioned the need to have a bridge, to maintain a bridge and also to build a new bridge in establishing the multiculturalism concept. My question is, what do you see the role of sending countries in supporting receiving countries in establishing multiculturalism? Thank you.
Thank you. And 2 rows back to Maruja.
Thank you very much. My name is Marla Asis from the Philippines. My first question is for Irena. Since the GFMD is a non-binding process, what are some of the benchmarks that can be used to assess the progress? And I'm also wondering whether there has been some discussions, even initial, within the GFMD process, whether some agreements, maybe some very basic agreements, can be reached at some point. And my second question is for Howard. You can tell that the Philippines and Indonesia are neighbors, no? Because we have the same questions. My second question is for Howard. What you have described to us as the Multiculturalism Act of Canada is indeed very impressive. But I also sense that it is for Canadians, and that is premised on Canada being a country accepting permanent settlers. But the trend in Canada also is that there's an increasing proportion of temporary migrant workers. And so again, what is the place of temporary migrant workers under the general idea of Canada being a multicultural society?
Okay, that's 3 questions. Why don't we hear from the audience? Reverend Han, can we start with you, please?
제가 이주 여성을 위해서 일한 지 15년이 됐고요. 그 정부가 이주 여성 그 사업을 시작하기 전부터 이주 여성하고 함께 했는데 제일 먼저 만든 게 쉼터였습니다. 이주 여성들이 이제 그 바이올런스를 당했을 때 갈 데가 없어 쉼터를 만들었고, 그래 쉼터를 하면 자연스럽게 하는 것이 상담이고, 그래서 폭력 피해 이주 여성을 상담을 하면서 이 사람들의 문제를 이제 돼갖고 정부에 이제 기구를 만들도록 제안을 하기 시작했습니다. 우선.
It's been 15 years since I've been working with migrant ladies, and I have started this work even before the government started to engage with the migrant ladies. And first of all, I created a resting place for the migrant ladies who have been under violence and sexual exploitation. And the first thing that we do there is consultation. And throughout the process, we hear from the migrant ladies' experiences, and we provide this information to the government so that they can create an organization for the migrant ladies.
Okay. Thank you. Irena.
Thank you very much. Let me take Indonesia's question first. Bringing multiculturalism into the agenda of the GFMD, I would submit that migrants, temporary, permanent, whatever their status, contribute to the multicultural patchwork or the multicultural culture. and the multicultural scenarios of their host countries. What the forum so far has dealt with is not multiculturalism per se, but integration. And we had a debate in 2009, which was interesting because some of the countries of destination were reluctant to discuss social welfare in the context of integration strategies. A lot of the developing countries of origin were very happy to discuss that, and in fact we went further and said the better you integrate someone when they go abroad, the better they're able to be reintegrated when they come home again, particularly when there's cooperation between the country of origin and country of destination. Especially in those areas that I mentioned before, but additional ones like having mutual recognition agreements, not just on skills, but having social security agreements so that people's social security benefits are portable, and so on. There's a whole slew of policy implications when you look at integration and reintegration in that continuum, on that continuum of migration. How to bring it into the GFMD? You are a member of the government. If not, go to your government and get them as a member of the Global Forum to put it on the agenda, to suggest to the future chairs to put it on the agenda again. How does it interface with development? I think you also asked. I started to answer that a little. The Global Forum, like most debates on migration and development, works with assumptions. And the assumptions are that the better integrated people are, as I said before, the better able they are to contribute to the development of their family, their communities, and so on, the better their own human development progresses. Because, again, it has flow-on effects. But I'm very happy to discuss that further with you. Benchmarks, I think this came from you, right? The benchmarks to assess the progress of the Global Forum. The Forum is a process. How do you assess the success or otherwise of a process? Except that it's continuing. It's still alive, when a number of people after the first or second year thought that it was going to die a natural or unnatural death. But governments are already lining up to be the future chairs of the forum, so that's already one measure of relative success. Other measures of success depend on the objectives. The objectives at the outset were very modest, to open a space for conflict-free dialogue and consultation, exchange of ideas and good practices between governments. And then I think over time we've drawn more of the natural partners in, the civil society, diaspora, and this year more and more the private sector. We've achieved that. We have a space now. We even have a common space where governments and civil society are able to debate issues in a very open way. We had a very successful common space, and perhaps Imelda from the Philippines could say more about that. If you look at the objectives that were set by the chair this year, namely to make a positive and measurable difference to the lives of migrants, the debates and the discussions within the Global Forum are unlikely to have an immediate effect on the conditions and the well-being of migrants and their families. But we're hoping that some of the policy changes that are occurring in some countries as a result of the debates in the Global Forum will, over time, have a beneficial effect for migrants and their families.
Okay, thank you very much. The question regarding the role of sending societies in building bridges. This is, in an age of transnationalism, a complex matter. And I wouldn't want to say that sending societies have an obligation to contribute to integration in Canada. I don't believe they have that obligation whatsoever. Can they be helpful? Of course they can. Can they be harmful? Of course they can. If we look at some of the potential harms that sending societies can exert, they're obvious when you are talking about conflicts in the homeland. We've had a number of, I would say, relatively minor cases of homeland organizations or governments themselves hoping or encouraging their migrants in Canada to contribute to a cause. It could be rebel groups that are located simultaneously in the homeland and in Canada that will try to encourage their fellow citizens to contribute to a cause of conflict. But these are matters that are relatively straightforward to deal with. We have courts that handle these things. We have diplomatic channels that are invoked to handle these things as a matter of course. There's also, I think, an interesting role that can and is played with respect to diaspora diplomacy. So you do have in Canada a number of communities that retain, again, strong transnational ties to the homeland, and they will be actively lobbying, and quite justifiably, lobbying the Canadian government to engage in trade relations, stronger trade relations, for example, stronger cultural relations, and so on. This is also a matter, of course, it's standard foreign policy. But when it comes down to the role that a sending society can play in social integration, or can play in integration in the labor market, that I think is something that is a little less straightforward. We do have cases of bilateral agreements, for example, with seasonal agricultural workers coming from Mexico up to Canada. Both governments, the homeland government and the host government, are involved not only in drafting the agreement but in implementing the agreement. So the Mexican government is quite actively involved in helping orient the farm workers to conditions in Canada and to explain the expectations of the program to the workers who come. And then the Canadian government has a responsibility to ensure that these individuals are well treated in the workplace, that they receive appropriate compensation, that the workplace conditions are safe, and so on. The cooperation between the two governments, I think, here is very helpful. Can you generalize from this? In principle, of course, you could, but it would get, I think, rather unwieldy. But in principle, I don't see any barriers here. The question about the role of multiculturalism, or perhaps I should go beyond that to talk about integration policy and programming with respect to temporary workers or temporary migrants. It's an interesting one in Canada these days because although the Canadian Constitution, this is important, the Canadian Constitution applies to everyone whose feet happen to be on Canadian soil, regardless of their citizenship, regardless of their legal status. And this is something that the Supreme Court of Canada ruled on in the 1980s, and it has had extraordinary effects. For example, with respect to the management of asylum claims. But that is to say that the rights and freedoms that Canadians enjoy are enjoyed by anybody who is on Canadian soil. Now, does this mean that the Multiculturalism Act is designed to apply to temporary foreign workers? Well, no, it is not, but that's a matter perhaps of emphasis. Now, there are programs, integration programs, for example, language courses, which are freely offered to permanent residents who migrate to Canada. These are not available in the main to temporary foreign workers, but there's a lobby in Canada now that is trying to have the integration programs expanded to cover not only permanent residents, but temporary foreign workers as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see an expansion. And the reason I say that is that increasingly Canada is making it easier for people on temporary visas, whether they are student visas or work visas, to convert their status to permanent residency. And if we're going to do that, I can just imagine this happening within the next 5 years or so. It making perfect sense that if you're going to convert these people's status to permanent residence, why not get a head start on their integration programming? That hasn't happened yet. I don't know whether or not it will. We happen to have an extraordinarily active minister in Canada these days, and it seems like something new is announced every other week. I don't see this happening tomorrow. I wouldn't be shocked if it happened, however, within the next year. Let's take another round of questions. I've got a hand here, a hand in front, and a hand there.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve from the United States, and I have a question for Howard. I share your admiration for the Multiculturalism Act, and as a citizen of the United States, I don't think I'm going on a limb and saying that the chances of something like that being passed in the United States is not very high. But I wonder if you're thinking about explaining the relative success of Canada and integration of migrants. Maybe there's a simpler explanation, and that would simply be Canada's geographic position being surrounded by oceans in the United States. In other words, you're not going to have border crossers. And also, Canada's very selective and sort of careful point system by which you are admitting certain foreigners to come in and naturalize. And I just wonder whether the nature of the integration challenge is very different for a country where the bulk of the migrants are going to be sort of, for example, poor rural migrants from Central America and such. So, I just wonder if that might be a more powerful explanation given the fact that you're trying to integrate a very different kind of population than I think some other countries are facing. And I think it seems to me, and maybe this is my lack of knowledge about Canada's system, but you do get a diverse system and a diverse mix of foreigners coming in. And it's not just simply folks who are fitting that kind of the 3D, the low income and the low wage work. And so I wonder how prescriptive Canada's success can be for different situations such as Korea or the United States.
Thank you very much. A row up, please. We're going to Uganda, if I recall.
Thank you very much. Bashasha is my name. I'm from Uganda. I just wanted to, I don't know who will answer this, but probably Reverend Han. I wanted to put across the issue of reverse migration. We seem to be focusing only on people who are coming outside of Korea and coming to Korea. But I want to bring on the table people who are actually leaving Korea and going to other countries. And the reason I mentioned Reverend Han is because the majority of these people are missionaries. Where I come from, there are about 500 to 600 Korean families, and about 75% are missionaries. And they work in very complicated, difficult places, deep in the rural areas. Actually, some of them even almost naively put themselves in harm's way, like trying to preach where they are not supposed to be. And we have interacted with some of them, and I have found many of them frustrated, ill-prepared, and the embassies are not actually ready to cater for them. Some of the embassies actually even don't know that these people exist somewhere. So I don't know what the civil society is doing in Korea to support these people, because they are there and they keep coming. Uganda probably has the smallest number. I know there are many in Kenya, there are many in, even in Arab countries like Iran and Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we'll cross the aisle.
My name is Tove Livendal and I come from Sweden. I have a question to Irena. You mentioned that the Global Forum had been acknowledging the question of skills, which I think is very important and maybe is caused by a kind of parochial-based inability. And after you have learned about examples of how different countries use the skills of returning migrants, I wonder if you could see any patterns. One would guess that a country where you have learned to use the skills and knowledge of immigrants would have easier to recognize internationally gained skills from your own homecoming countrymen as well, seeing it as international competence, no matter if it came from immigrants or immigrants returning home. So I wonder if you see any pattern there. Another thought that I've heard, which do not conflict with the first assumption, is that perhaps the best practices in using skills gained in foreign countries could come from developing countries, since they simply cannot afford talented persons to walk out of the country's brain drain. They need, besides the remittances, secure the link between those talented persons and origin countries. So I wonder if that is something you have discovered in your work.
Okay, thank you. We'll look after these questions, and then we'll have time for at least one more round. Steve, I actually do think that there are elements of the Canadian experience with multiculturalism that could serve as a model for just about anywhere, and I'll try to explain what those are. Is integration easier in Canada because we cherry pick? Well, we don't cherry pick that many. A lot of people seem to think that we cherry pick 100% of our permanent residents each year, the 250,000 roughly. Well, we don't. We cherry pick, it varies from year to year, but I'm going to say roughly 22%. And those are the people who are the principal applicants for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now, they bring their families, but we don't select their families. We still let the migrants select their own families. And they can then sponsor their parents and grandparents, and we don't select them either. Those people are effectively entitled to come, all other things being equal. And then we have roughly 15,000, 20,000 refugees who come in one way or another to Canada. And of course, we don't select them, at least for economic advantage. And in fact, there was a time when we selected refugees for their integration potential, but we stopped doing that roughly a decade ago. So we're looking at 75% of newcomers to Canada each year who are not selected. So I'm not sure that things are particularly easier in that respect. Now, geographically, there are effects. We don't have the same level of illegal, or sorry, that's the wrong word to use, I should slap myself, undocumented migration as the United States. Irregular. And I think it's for two reasons. It's where we are located. It's easier for them to stop in the United States rather than make their way all the way up to Canada. But of course, employment possibilities are much stronger in the United States. So we don't have that problem to the same extent. But when you look at migration from India to Canada, the vast majority come from Punjab, and many of them are farmers. We're not talking about high-tech people from Bangalore, by and large. We're talking about people who have modest skills. They come through family reunification. Now, have we got an integration challenge? Some people would say, absolutely we do. You go to northwest Toronto, and you see this massive Indian or South Asian enclave. You go to northeast Toronto, and you find a massive Chinese enclave. And people suggest that this shows that you've got an integration failure. But there's absolutely no conflict about this. These two communities are middle class, they're vibrant, they're healthy. The reason people live there is because they want to. And if I could afford a house there, I would want to live there too. So I don't think that we have any particular integration advantages. Now, why do I think that some of what goes on in Canada could serve as a model for Korea? My view is that one reason that we have been successful in Canada is that the government for the last, well, let's go back to when we gave up our white-only policy in 1967 and introduced the point system. The government has done, and it doesn't matter which political party we're talking about, government after government has been very successful in gaining the confidence of the public, gaining the confidence that migration is being well managed for the benefit of Canadians. This is very important, for the benefit of Canadians, that integration is being well managed for the benefit of all, And with that confidence, the formation of enclaves does not get the mainstream Canadians concerned. Mainstream Canadians have come to believe that immigrants come to Canada with the intention to contribute to the society, and by and large, that has been borne out. So what can Korea learn from this? Leadership. When the Multiculturalism Act, well, let's go back to the policy. When the policy was proclaimed, it was proclaimed by the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister sent his cabinet ministers across the country explaining to Canadians why this was taking place, and over time gained extraordinary levels of support. Even during the recession, levels of support for multiculturalism in Canada were remaining at the 80% plus levels. It's all due to leadership, which has gained the public confidence. Korea and any other country could learn from that. Han.
According to your question, I know the lot of ministers and the students visited and come to the Africa or the another areas, even Muslim areas. And our government warning has a warning about this in danger. And I think it is the different dimension between the migrant and the evangelization of this fact, so action. So this dangerous the human rights issues they have a duty for the sending churches in Korea. So I think we must separate the discussion about this migration and the evangelization work to other countries. This is my opinion.
Thank you, Irena.
Thanks very much. One of the things that I think one has to understand about the Global Forum is that it's not a standard-setting forum. It looks at good practices, why and how they've worked as well as they have, and then draws from these exemplary cases some almost like a set of principles. I mean, we don't call it that because that's getting very close to normative. But we draw out of the examples, the good practices that other governments and other agencies might find worth replicating or adapting to their own situations. On the issue of skills and the patterns, I think one of the best examples might be the Mexican one, and I think our Mexican colleague has just left. There is not a pattern, but what the Global Forum has been looking at is a growing incidence at the lower skilled level in regions like the United Arab Emirates of mismatches of skills and jobs. And how you deal with that, firstly by ensuring that people have developed the appropriate skills for the job, and that happens in the country of origin. Secondly, that the contracts are not tampered with, that the contracts are negotiated in a fair way and properly, as the Philippines do with their labour receiving countries. Thirdly, that the recruitment costs are lowered, so people are not forced to pay high recruitment fees and become indebted to the recruiters, and in fact spend the first few months of their working life abroad repaying their debts. And then once they're there, what we've looked at, largely through the work of the United Arab Emirates in trying to reform its approach to temporary labour migration, is social protection. So income protection, social protection, and better matching of skills and jobs. It's part of a more total approach. It's not just looking at skills. And the examples that are being set by some governments, and I turn again to the United Arab Emirates, which has changed its laws in the last few years, in part in connection with the discussion that we've been having or that they've been sharing with us in the Global Forum. For example, electronic transfer of contracts from the sending country to the receiving country, so that there's no manipulation or tampering of with the contract at the other end. The question about talent leaving and brain drain, brain waste, that links up with this. If you match your skills and jobs more appropriately, and people are appropriately remunerated and get the wage that they're entitled to, and if the country of origin is smart, like the Philippines, and negotiates a decent wage for their domestic workers or other workers, then the issue of brain waste, there is no issue of brain waste, but there is often a brain waste when they come home. Particularly if, for example, they've used mechanized equipment as farm workers. Remember that I'm talking mostly about lower skilled, the lower end of the labour market, when they come home and they can't use their new skills. And there are ways that governments of countries of origin and destination can discuss this. And the best example, when I said before, we draw from good examples, some basic principles that apply to all or many other governments. One of the best examples we looked at was the Mauritian circular migration arrangement with France and Canada, which as a model is a business model. It's an example of a developing country that actually comes to the table as an equal business partner, not as a mendicant begging for labor positions in the richer labor market. And so they have something to offer. And then the partner has something to offer them. So there's a deal struck. We will train our people across several sectors at the lower end of the labour market. You can use them, but you must open up your visa and work permit system and allow them to move from employer to employer. And in return, we want you to help us to train these people and reskill them if they come back and have to go into a different kind of job when they come home. So there's a really decent kind of a business arrangement, and the Philippines is the only other government that I know of that strikes these kinds of fair deals for their employees. The other government is Mexico, and they're not here, and they negotiate with educational and training institutions in the US for certificates to be given to people who haven't completed their formal vocational training, for those certificates not just to be recognized for the work they're doing in the US, but also to be recognized when they come back to Mexico.
Thank you. I've been given the 5-minute sign. I'd like to get 2 more questions in. I've got Dimitri, and is there one more hand? Okay, Dimitri.
Thank you. I don't have a question. I do, however, have a comment. Because I didn't want to have all these nice people around this room take away misperceptions about the U.S. system. Yeah, we do not have a multiculturalism policy. We don't have legislation. But something that people ought to realize is that what we have is a panoply of civil rights acts, all of which passed in the 1960s, that amount to the same thing. Furthermore, in my own rankings, and I have done that, in terms of the most multiculturalists of places, on the ground, the United States may in fact be more multiculturalist than even Canada is. Because of these legislations, which they might as well be in the Constitution, things that were never intended, just like in your case, the Canadian case, things that were never intended by the authors of these pieces of legislation have taken lives of their own that are completely irreversible. They have to do with creating special districts for minorities to be able to be elected, with rights that are totally irreversible. And it is very important that we're not left with the impression that somehow, you know, the United States is a laggard in that regard. It is anything but a laggard. On another point that was earlier today, you know, the index that whoever it is, you know, has created about investments, et cetera, by the United States, and the United States being somewhere in the middle. There are two major sources of extraordinary amounts of funding that never find their way into these indices. Number one, billions upon billions of dollars that states spend, your provinces, in other words, states spend on immigrant integration. In the case of New York, for instance, just for specialized language instruction, over $500 million a year. This is very large numbers. Also, there are numbers that are hidden within large, very large grants that the federal government gives that are in effect directed at people who qualify, and the majority of those people who qualify are indeed immigrants. And again, they have to do with language training, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, something that does not exist in any other place, we have this almost uniquely American, I know the Brits have it, and maybe, you know, Canada will get it sometime, of private foundations that are putting on the table a remarkable amount of money that tries to accomplish the same thing that federal money, in your case, and central government money in other cases, are trying to accomplish. So I think it is completely deceptive when you look at, you know, direct expenditures by the federal government on immigrants to actually think that the United States doesn't do anything. We attempted at the Institute to measure these amounts of money, and we left it somewhere in the $15 billion a year category. So, you know, I think that since we're talking about all of these issues, it is important for all of us here to not be left with the impression that somehow, you know, the United States has what many describe somehow as a laissez-faire policy with regard. It has anything but a laissez-faire policy, but it is not the federal government that actually does the doing. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And of course, you could have added the work that's been done for decades by churches, social agencies. We've had years of this trope that the United States is a melting pot and Canada is a mosaic. It's nonsense. We are absolutely out of time, so could you please join me in thanking our panel.